I thought it would be good, given the journey that we've taken today from kind of the frameworks and principles through to some of these much bigger, long-term spines of data linkage, to just actually share some of the work that we've been doing in the Commonwealth Education and Training Department, many in partnership with NCVER and states and territories, and just, I suppose, get to the pointy end of why we're doing data linkage and talk about some of the policy problems we're investigating and how we've used data linkage techniques to start to chip away at some of those answers. So the first one I'm going to talk about is some work we did a number of years ago, linking data that is publicly available on training.gov.au with some ATO business income records. Gives us a bit of a sense of financial viability in the vet market. We ended up with about 2,000 matched records. So it's, caveat, it's not all vet providers. We were obviously limited only by those who are actual companies as well. And look, I think the profit side was pretty interesting. You can see that just over a third of RTOs in that year that we were able to get match records for were actually operating at a loss or at no profit. And then about 60% had profit of $1 million or less, and then a few were killing it. So just gives us a different insight into a part of the vet market that we don't actually collect data on. So that's project number one. Project number two, just to kind of jump to a very different part of education, our early childhood education colleagues were tasked with looking into the implementation of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education Strategy by the Education Council, and as part of that commissioned a project to identify areas that might minimise developmental vulnerabilities of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and the role of early childhood education in that. So this project combined 3 data sets, the National Early Childhood Education and Care Collection, the Australian Early Development Census, and national quality data, which is collected on the performance of all childcare providers. And look, you can basically see that there's a kind of across-the-board impact of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who attended some form of early childhood education. The project actually found that the impact was maximised if they attended for 15 hours or more per week, participated in a full 2 years of early childhood education, and if the service they attended was of a high quality. So that was pretty compelling evidence a couple of years back in terms of investment in early childhood education, and a number of states and territories would have seen those results back then as well. So now coming back to VET, it's a project that was supported through the Skills Senior Officials Network data subgroup. So many of you in the room will be familiar with this. NCVER and the ATO and the Commonwealth Department, who we have a database called TIMS, which holds all the apprenticeship and trainee data in it. We all worked together to combine those 3 data sources with the aim to see what happens to apprentices and trainees after they finish their apprenticeship and trainee, or for those that don't finish, what are their income impacts. So this is one of the findings that, as you can see, basically shows that for younger apprentices and trainees, doing an apprenticeship at that time of life gives them a significant income boost above their peers. Later in life, it obviously not only drops off but reverses, which intuitively makes sense because a lot of people at that in the older demographics are kind of in the prime of their career, whereas apprenticeships, after your apprenticeship, you're often kind of starting off at an earlier stage in a newer career. So that was a very interesting project. Many of you will say, what happens after 2 years? And unfortunately, and until we get this data into MADIP, we don't know the answer, but we are working towards getting this TIMS data into MADIP over the next period, and so that will be one of the questions that we are very keen to go in there and investigate. So this is a current project underway that we thought might be of interest. This is a project that our higher education colleagues are doing. It's a really interesting example of how you can have a kind of multi-step data integration process and then use the end data for lots of different purposes. So in essence, it takes the higher ed loan program or HELP data that we hold within the Commonwealth Department of Education and Training, and that data is passed on, both kind of annually and the historical records as well, to the ATO, who strip it of its personal information and adds a special code for the Australian Government Actuary, who then picks it up, does their thing, which adds some liability data and some other demographic and other data they have to kind of, and do their clever actuarial thing in calculating, possible loan repayment ratios and things like that. And then it all kind of comes back together into a new database where it can be analysed. One of the things that our higher education colleagues are doing is looking at the potential of publishing some of the aggregate results on their consumer-facing website, Quality Indicators for Learning or Teaching, or QUILT, as you may be familiar referring to it. So there's the opportunity to say, publish median income for field of education or even provider if it's, big enough sample. And that will provide really accurate data to consumers to an extent that we've never been able to do before. So my final example is another project underway. So this is one of the proof of concept projects ahead of the full implementation of the National Education Evidence Base that you heard Phil talk about earlier. So what we're doing is an exploratory project to see what kind of overlap and interface there might be between people who are accessing both higher education and vet systems. And so what you have up there is kind of fairly technical information which represents some of the findings from the initial phase of this project. So USI, we have about 7.9 records that have been put into this project. Sorry, for a million, yes, thank you. And we've matched them all there. 7.9 million records. And on the higher ed, the Cheson side, we've got about 4.8. And so quite fascinatingly, I think, for us, is that the initial findings is there's actually a match of 1.1 million records, which once you've done some cleaning out of both sides of the records, represents just over 30%. So it's not we can't quite conclude yet that that means there's a 30% overlap between higher ed and vet. The next phase of the project will have to go through further steps around looking for duplicate records and a whole bunch of other things. But that's just some really exciting early findings. And clearly the policy problems they're not problems, they're kind of policy opportunities we're trying to explore is really just to understand, sequence. Are people doing higher ed before vet or vet before higher ed? And if they're going one way or another, what are they studying? Are there particular demographic cohorts that are more likely to be just doing one or the other or both? Once we actually do phase 2, which is adding in the educational records from both vet and higher education, we're actually going to be able to answer those questions for what I think is actually the first time in a reliable way. So yeah, watch this space, work in progress. So just to kind of wrap up, and I'm happy to take questions. I know that there are a number of researchers, both academic and state and territory, and others in the room today who've done some awesome kind of once-off policy-focused data linkage projects. I'd really like to invite people in the Q&A session to just kind of give a sentence or two about the types of policy programs policy problems that you're trying to solve through data linkage, because I suspect we're playing in a similar space, and there's not only a lot we can learn together from a methodological perspective, but I suspect there's some collaborations waiting to happen. So yeah, I'd just like to invite others to contribute anything they think would be really interesting to the room. Thanks, everyone.